excited today to welcome Alexander C. Eberhart to the podcast. Alex has always had a passion for writing, even from a young age. He lives on the cusp of Atlanta, spending his days writing stories with queer characters and drinking an unfathomable amount of coffee. When he isn't crafting quality queer fiction, you can find him mostly curled up alongside his boyfriend watching a movie or another equally lazy task. Alex's debut novel, There Goes Sunday School, came out in June. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, everyone.
So good to have you here. A couple episodes back, I reviewed There Goes Sunday School, and I just absolutely adored it, not only for its kind of fresh take on going to a religious school as queer kids, but also some of the twists and turns you took readers on. So tell us what your take on what There Goes Sunday School is about without hitting any spoilers.
Absolutely. So There Goes Sunday School is the story of 16-year-old closeted kid named Michael Hernandez. He attends a Christian high school just outside of Atlanta. It's actually based on the north side, which is known to be a more affluent area, but definitely has those conservative roots. So it is about Michael, who is so entrenched in the Christian lifestyle. His family goes to church. He goes to that Christian conservative school. And it really was based off of the thought of what would happen if a boy fell in love with the pastor's son, was kind of the spark that started this whole thing. But anyway, so it's about... So Michael is an artist, and he has all these internalized feelings of conflict between his religion and his sexuality, and so kind of how he processes that. So Michael also likes to share his emotions and feelings and kind of pour them into his art. So there are a few of his drawings that are a tad on the risque side. And it's just what happens when one day his sketchbook goes missing in the middle of Sunday school. And it is actually found by the pastor's son, and the conflict that draws in as he finds out that the pastor's son, Chris, is also gay, and kind of how they start to process through those feelings themselves.
You mentioned the seed of what if Mike was in love with the preacher's kid as some of the inspiration. What else all went into this as you were crafting out what this story would be?
Yeah, so like I said, it started, I was sitting at my kitchen table, and I had actually just completed a manuscript, and I was thinking of a new idea of what to get started on next. And it all just kind of started with this idea of oh man, like as a teenager, when I was growing up in church, I was like, man, what would happen if this closeted kid started having feelings for someone that he thought was inaccessible, or like the worst, the absolute worst outcome, or the worst possibility. And it kind of spitballed from there. And I started thinking, I was like, okay, so how would that play out? And what would they be forced to deal with when, they're surrounded by all of this conservative rhetoric and just, dealing with those emotions. So it started with that idea, and I kind of kept rolling it from there. And the story honestly just organically grew by itself.
Which is very cool when they can just kind of spring up like that.
Yeah.
Are you mostly a plotter or a pantser when it comes to writing?
Yeah. I've never heard that term pantser until I listened to an episode a couple of weeks back. And I was like, oh man, that is the perfect way to describe it. I would consider, I'm definitely more of a pantser. I usually start my projects with a general arc of the story. I know where I want to go, but essentially the plot writes itself. I mean, I sit down to my computer and I think, okay, I know where I want to end up. Now let's see how I get there.
That's so cool. And that kind of, we were talking before we hit the record button on some of the amazing twists and turns you take in this book. I love a book, obviously, that I can't figure out where it's going, but there were places in here that you just was like, whoa, he just did that. All of those organic, or did they kind of get plotted along the way somewhere?
So I knew there were a couple of highlights I wanted to hit. I wanted to have that big conflict between Mike and Chris. I knew I wanted his art to be to have a pivotal role in the storyline, and I knew that I wanted to ultimately tell a story of hope to be found kind of in the middle of all of this doubt and guilt that's conflicting Mike as we go throughout the story. So I'd say most of it came organically. Like I said, I knew where I wanted to go. So I just said, how would a 16-year-old high school kid get there?
And I think you really, especially for kids in the South, and Atlanta is kind of like a unicorn of the South because it can certainly lean more purple than red in some cases, but especially for religious kids and others who feel very closeted, I think you captured Mike's angst and uptightness to an amazing degree. Did that show up in your first drafts, or did that just get manipulated over time to get it there?
I think so. Throughout the book, Mike has these conversations in his head, and they're actually they're based a lot on my thought process growing up. I constantly had this internal monologue that you could say is kind of like a conversation with God. That's how it's portrayed in the book. Mike is constantly talking to God in a kind of funny way, in a kind of irreverent way, honestly. But that's definitely something that I did growing up as well. But no, I think that was really that really added a lot of depth into how you see Mike process exactly what's going on around him. So he uses that conversation to help him work through those feelings that he's having when he's surrounded by all these people that are saying gay is not okay, and there's something wrong with you. He's just constantly asking those same questions that I grew up asking.
How autobiographical might this be?
That's really funny. I actually wrote my first blog post that went up on my author website, and I've had a lot of people, mostly people that I know, that have asked me, that have read the book. They're like, "Man, is this like your story? Is this how it was growing up for you?" And I was like, "My life is not that entertaining, guys. I promise." but no, more so his thought process was really pulled from a lot of my own experience. I thankfully I did grow up in a church that was mostly conservative, but I came from a family that is just so open and so accepting. And even though I came out later in life, I came out in my early 20s. I felt like that was mostly my choice than it was from kind of like a repressive place. But yeah, so absolutely none of it is true. None of that really happened to me. My pastor's son was kind of a douchebag, honestly. So no, I would never have fallen for him. But no, it was just so almost cathartic in writing it out and developing the story and realizing that I wish that there would have been a book like this when I was that age, that I could see that there are more possibilities than I thought were possible growing up in that setting.
From a POV perspective, I found myself wanting to know what Chris was thinking as well. Was it a consideration to have it go back and forth for a while, or was this always going to be Mike's book?
I started off with the intention of it really being a singular POV. I have a couple of projects that do swap back and forth between chapters, between multiple perspectives, but I think that I really wanted to show just a single narrative growth throughout the whole thing, and how he comes to terms with who he is. I hope that you get to see glimpses of how Chris is dealing with his own process, because when we come into it, Chris is actually so much further along than Mike is when it comes to acceptance of himself, which I think is kind of another unique take on the story, because he is the one that's more in depth into the religious life. I mean, his father is the pastor; he lives it day in and day out. Um, but no, I think it always started as a singular. Throughout all of my drafts, it was always just from Mike's perspective. And though a lot of Chris's personality kind of changes over the different versions I created of the story, that one thing kind of stayed the same.
Hmm. And Chris certainly comes through, and I would agree that as they finally start talking to each other, you can see that Chris is further down that path. And I like that they certainly help each other. It's not a one-sided help in sorting things out.
Definitely. Yeah, it's so helpful to have. I mean, I had that friend growing up, that best friend that I was able to confide pretty much everything I was thinking. Um, and they were pivotal in my journey of, accepting who I am and coming to terms with my sexuality. But no, it's a constant. I mean, it's a back and forth game. I mean, you ask the question and they have the answers, and they ask their questions, and sometimes you just need another perspective.
Hmm. Was this actually? I know it wasn't planned as your first book because you'd mentioned earlier on that you had finished something else and then started with this idea. How did this then become the first book?
Sure. So I this was actually my third completed manuscript. I started off writing magical realism. Actually, I was not very good at it, to be completely honest. But that's kind of been my evolutionary journey. So I started with a magical realism book. From that, I went on to write a romantic comedy based in a coffee shop. And then my third one, I was just, you know what, let's throw caution to the wind. I think I'd finally given myself permission to write the book that I'd always wanted to write. My previous projects had been a little tame and a little subdued, I guess you could say. And even though I'd queried those out to a couple of different people, the feedback I was getting, it just wasn't really in the market right now. So the market wasn't looking for those types of stories. So I I actually got done reading Simon versus the Homo sapien Agenda. We were talking about Becky Albertalli earlier, and I put that book down, and I was like, man, I want to write a book just like I want to write a book like this. I want to write a book that's unapologetic in how it explores what young people go through, especially in the South. And so Simon is based in Atlanta as well, or just outside of Atlanta, and that's kind of just my thought process of the whole thing. It's like this I feel like is going to be so much more of a marketable book. This is going to be one that's really going to connect with a lot of people.
Hmm. And you talk about Atlanta, of course. Becky's based in Atlanta herself.
Yes.
Running with Lions author Julian Winters is also, in the Atlanta area, and now you're in the Atlanta area. What is it about Atlanta that like has this convergence of YA authors going on?
I don't know. Well, I'm thinking I have to blame it all on the influx of art that's come to Atlanta. Atlanta has always been a hub for artists. We have so much great local theater and playwrights. But now that the movie industry has moved here, so much filming goes on around here. I think it's just really kind of driven the artists out of the woodwork. They're able to come forward and people take Atlanta, I guess, more seriously now when they think about what it has to offer to the world. So not only can you shoot a Marvel movie in Atlanta, but you can also get great YA fiction.
And not just YA fiction, but YA LGBTQ fiction.
Yes. Finally, it's coming.
Going back to the book, what was there unexpected things that kind of cropped up as you went from that first draft process all the way through production as your first time out with this?
Yeah, absolutely. Querying this book was so much of an emotional roller coaster for me. I think I was on submission for this book. I was querying this book for about a year. So I finished it in late in the summer of 2016, and I started sending it out. I had what I felt was a great query letter, and it definitely generated a lot more responses than my previous projects had. I ended up sending it out to well over, I think it was about 102 editors and agents sending it out. And I received great feedback. Patricia Nelson from Lyson agency over in I think she's out of San Francisco. She was great in the whole process. I actually had submitted the first version of this manuscript to her, and she loved it. And she said, this has such a strong voice, but I really feel like you need to work on, she actually asked me to revise it and resend it to her. And so I took her notes down and I rewrote it in about 2 months time. I ended up just rewriting the entire last half of the book. and it turned it into such a stronger concept and such a stronger story, in my opinion. But yeah, so I mean, they were great. I had great feedback from it, and but honestly, that whole the whole creating process was just, I was a nervous wreck the whole time. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about, but I checked my phone way more often than I should, and I was just constantly waking up and looking at my email, and at work I'd pull out my phone to look at my email, and just waiting for that one yes to come through,
Well, I'm glad it did to finally get this book into people's hands for sure. Looking back, what got you started with writing?
Yeah, so I've always had a love for writing. It actually, the first thing I ever remember as far as writing a story goes, was actually back in fourth grade. I was, yeah, a quick side note about me. I was actually homeschooled my entire life. So kindergarten through graduation, I was homeschooled. So that explains some of my weird idiosyncrasies, I promise. But I remember there was this one assignment that I got from my parents, and it was writing a short story. And I think it was around fourth grade. And I wrote this story about an air freshener. And his name was Stan the air freshener. And not only was he this creepy, sentient air freshener, but he was also a detective. And it was his job to locate and exterminate bad smells. And so that was actually my first kind of diving into creating stories, and it just kind of snowballed from there. So from those short stories I wrote in elementary school, it became message board role playing with my friends in middle school. So I had a lot of creative friends that also loved to write. So we would write stories back and forth over message boards, and then that became novel writing. So I started writing by myself, and I actually self-published a novel as my senior project in high school. And my dad edited it and formatted it and put it out into the world. And Lord, looking back, I wish I never had, because that was such a cringy story. But no, of writing was there from a young age for me. And I think it really just, stemmed back from how much I read as a kid. I was just constantly reading from the Chronicles of Narnia growing up, moving into DJ McHale's Pendragon series, and then eventually into some of the more modern YAs as I got older. It's just really played this really important part of my life and how I express myself creatively.
I love that you remember what you wrote in fourth grade.
That one's hard to forget. I swear I need to see if my parents still have a copy. I think I actually got that story like hand bound and and turned it in like I was writing my thesis as Stan the air freshener.
You mentioned a little bit about what you tend to read. Who else are out there, like the books you like and kind of your author inspirations?
Oh gosh, I devour just about every LGBT young adult book around right now. I am obsessed with Sean David Hutchinson. His books, We Are the Ants, The 5 Stages of Andrew Bradley, I think is what it is. I just got done reading his most recent Elena Mendoza. He blends queer fiction in with certain subtle sci-fi elements that usually stem back to not to say mental disorders, but kind of the headspace that you are in as a teenager. And it's just so creative and so well written. I just eat up pretty much everything that he writes.
Very cool. Yeah, I've read one of his. I think I've read Ants, and
Yes.
that's quite something. It's a little outside my usual genre space, but
Yeah.
it's certainly there.
It's
Um,
just it's just so interesting. Like when I picked up that book, it was actually referred to me by a friend. That was the first one I read of his. And I was just like, this was not what I expected, like at all. Like this just threw me for a loop, and I loved every minute of it.
exactly. It was a nice, because sometimes if it's not what you expect, you're like, not what
Yeah,
I wanted. But that one just like, yeah, it's the book
yeah,
I didn't know I needed.
exactly.
So what's coming up next for you now that there goes Sunday schools out in the world?
Yes. So There Goes Sunday School, of course, is a standalone. I have another standalone novel that's signed with Seven Sisters. That's tentatively called. I don't think it's going to change at this point. But it's called Locke and West, and that's actually the names of the two main characters. That one is a dual POV story, and that one kind of is an exploration. It revolves around two 16-year-olds based in Atlanta again. I'm probably going to keep doing that because I love my city. But it explores a couple of darker themes than There Goes Sunday School is. Even though there's a lot of heavy situations in There Goes Sunday School, I think there's a kind of an air of levity throughout the whole thing. Hopefully it kept you laughing as you went through, and that's what that kept you turning the pages. But this one dives a little bit more into mental health. It looks at disgusting school lunches and just exactly what goes on backstage during a high school production of Romeo and Juliet. So, stuff to look forward to there. That one is in the editing process right now. We're looking at kind of a late 2018 release, so it won't be too much longer before that one hits shelves as well.
Oh, awesome. Something more to look forward to just this year.
Yes.
I like it when they just keep rolling right out.
I'm going to try to.
So how can people keep up with you online to find out about that next book and what comes after?
Absolutely. You can find me on all the main things. So I got Facebook. You can find me, you can like my author page there. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and I also have my author website that's linked to, you can find all my social media from there. And that is alexanderceberhart.com. And yeah, that's the best way to keep up with me.
Fantastic. Well, Alex, thank you so much for coming on and talking about There Goes Sunday School with us. And we'll have to have you back on the show when the next book comes out.
Yeah, I would be delighted.